Anyone who knows anything about Elvis Presley knows that he was a very religious man, but most people tend to think of him as a conventional Christian. Actually, the truth is far more interesting. He was brought up in the Assembly of God Church in Tupelo, Mississippi, which is, I was just down there in May. It's a very small town. Still, this was Bible Belt Christianity. They were fundamentalist. So every word in the Bible was the literal word of God, and they were Pentecostal, so that you expected to see people jumping around with the Holy Spirit in church and speaking in tongues. The Presley family moved to Memphis when he was 14. His mother and father attended services there, but they never joined the church. He did a little later in his teens, but it perhaps was more social than religious motivations there. The church there had one of the most noted choirs, gospel choirs in the South. If you've ever heard of the Blackwood Brothers, their family lived there, and so they attended quite often and would sing as part of the service. So that's probably what helped motivate him to do that. It was also a good place to meet girls. I want to point that out. Elvis was a shy guy as a teenager. He would often go to the East Trig Church. He would go to the First Assembly of God Church in Memphis, and after the service was started, he would slip out the back with his girlfriend, and they would drive a few blocks to there's a black church down at the East Trig Church. He really liked the gospel choir there. So he would go and wait and watch and listen, and then just before the end, he would drive back and show up at the end of the service of his own church. But he loved the gospel music so much, he even tried out for the choir at the First Assembly of God Church. They had a splinter group of the main choir called the Song Fellows. When one of the members moved away, Elvis auditioned. The pastor's son gave him the bad news, telling him he just didn't have a good voice. Elvis, he said, "Why don't you just give it up?" We all know how that worked out. In 1956, Elvis didn't just become famous. What happened was unprecedented for him. Maybe Frank Sinatra, maybe Rudolph Valentino could understand what happened to him, but they weren't in his league for the response and the fanaticism. Only the Beatles, a decade later, really came close to what happened to Elvis. I mean, he was at the top of the mountain, pursued by everybody, and with the hysterical fans. I ran across a great quote by Elvis's guitarist, Scotty Moore, about that year in 1956. He said, "We were the only band in history that was directed by an ass. It was like being in a sea of sound." He was just totally swamped, just like the Beatles were later. He loved being at the center of the craziness. He never understood it, but he accepted and enjoyed it. Elvis was grateful to God, and he had the feeling that he had been singled out for some purpose, some reason. The way things unfolded, he quickly became known as the king of rock and roll. That overshadowed his love of gospel music, but it was always there. The last song he sang on Ed Sullivan was "Peace in the Valley," backed by the Jordanaires. And at Christmas 1957, when the RCA wanted a Christmas album to promote, Elvis insisted on one side being religious music. By the way, to this day, it's the best-selling Christmas album of all time. He was drafted in early 1958. A few months later, before he was to be deployed to Germany, his mother died very suddenly of heart failure at 46. It was the single most traumatic event of his life, before or after. He was totally devastated. When he went to Germany, the people who knew him recalled his interest in reincarnation and parapsychology. The brush with mortality must have had a big impact on him. He read the Bible daily, and he often gave impromptu sermons to his friends and assistants. He'd get up on a table at home and preach as though from the pulpit. One of his first albums after leaving the Army was His Hand in Mine. We've just heard a couple of tracks from that here. It was a gospel album. He put all the favorite songs of his youth onto that album. Outside his career in music, Elvis had a dream. He wanted to be a great actor, the new James Dean. Most of his early films were the kind that Dean would have made if he hadn't died so young. Take a look at King Creole, which was actually developed with James Dean in mind and directed by the man who won an Oscar for Casablanca. But Elvis's fans didn't share his dream. They associated him with fun and music. His box office suffered. His manager, Colonel Tom Parker, convinced him that if he didn't give the fans what they wanted, he was going to lose them. So he started to make the frivolous films that we all remember. They were hugely popular at first. He quickly became the highest paid actor in the world. He had the world by the tail, but he found it unsatisfying. Ever since he shot to fame in 1956, he had the gut feeling that God had singled him out for some special purpose. But after several years, he had to ask himself for what? To make girl happy and kissing cousins? That's where things stood in April 1964. He was in Hollywood to film Roustabout. His hairstylist moved on and he tried out a new one, a man named Larry Geller. Elvis had heard that Geller was a person devoted to spiritual and mystical subjects. When he was called to Elvis's home, Geller was surprised when the king started peppering him with questions about spiritual matters. When he showed surprise, Elvis reassured him, "I really need to hear this. You have no idea what this means to me." Geller told Elvis about the books he had read, and one in particular, The Impersonal Life. I'm sure it's a familiar title to many of you. Geller brought a copy on his next visit. The Impersonal Life instantly became one of Elvis's favorite books. He ordered 100 copies. He started giving them away to his friends, and often with passages underlined. Geller also introduced him to Autobiography of a Yogi and Beyond the Himalayas, and the books of Madame Blavatsky, Isis Unveiled and The Secret Doctrine. Elvis went on to study over 1,000 books on esoteric subjects. Books by Krishnamurti, Uspensky, Ledbetter, Manly Palmer Hall, and others. Wherever he traveled, his men had to lug around a personal library of 200 books. One of the books he found most interesting was The Initiation of the World by Vera Stanley Alder. Elvis came to believe in the Great White Brotherhood. I'm sure many of you are familiar with the group. They're alleged to be a band of advanced beings who live in the Himalayas and direct the evolution of the human race. Trying to make sense of his own success, Elvis concluded that he was being guided by masters, one of whom was Jesus. He was a voracious reader and he kept studying, but what he really hoped for was a revelation. That came in March 1965. He was driving from Memphis to Hollywood to begin filming Harem Scarum. Elvis didn't like to fly, so he would drive to the coast in a customized Dodge motorhome. He and a few of the Memphis Mafia were on Route 66 near Flagstaff, Arizona. Elvis was at the wheel and Larry Geller was sitting up front with him. Suddenly, Geller heard him say, "Whoa, do you see what I see?" Geller looked ahead to see what had caught Elvis's attention. There was only one cloud in the sky, a very strange cloud. It was in the shape of a face, and the person it resembled was unmistakable, Joseph Stalin. You have to imagine yourself back in that era to get the impact. In those days, Stalin was seen as every bit as evil as Adolf Hitler. He was responsible for the deaths of millions of people, ordered the deaths of hundreds of thousands of Russians, created artificial famines that killed Ukrainians. The cloud gradually began to lose its shape. But suddenly, Elvis hit the brakes and pulled off the road. He opened the door of the motorhome and went running into the desert, calling for Geller to follow him. Elvis could barely speak. He said that he kept asking himself why the cloud had taken the form of Stalin. Was God trying to send him a message? If God meant that he was evil like Stalin, then he silently asked God to destroy him. He didn't want to live as something evil. He wanted to be filled with kindness and love. And then it happened, he told Geller. The face of Stalin turned right into the face of Jesus, and he smiled at me. And every fiber of my being felt it. For the first time in my life, God and Christ are a living reality. Geller didn't know what to say. He'd only seen the face of Stalin. But he could plainly see that Elvis was experiencing some kind of religious ecstasy. Actually, there was much more to the epiphany of April 1965. But at the time, Elvis was too shaken to confide it to anyone, even Geller. It wasn't until 9 years later that he finally confessed all that he had experienced. While he was filming Harum Scarum, Elvis reread Autobiography of a Yogi. The book had a profound effect on him. One day he looked up from reading and told Geller that he felt he was ready to be initiated into Kriya Yoga. The world headquarters of the Self-Realization Fellowship happened to be near Hollywood. Elvis met the head of the group, Sri Dayamata. She was a direct disciple of Swami Yogananda. Elvis was immediately fond of her because she looked so much like his mother Gladys. He told Dayamata that he felt called to be a spiritual leader to his fans. He said he was prepared to turn his back on his career and start a commune. Dayamata persuaded him not to do anything rash. She loaned him her personal lesson books and coached him on meditation techniques and spiritual development. For the next couple of years, he committed himself and worked to develop his powers. One of the members of the Memphis Mafia, George Klein, recalled him practicing telekinesis. Klein said Elvis once made him watch while he waved his hands above a bush. Klein allowed that it might have been coincidence, but the bush did move. Elvis also practiced faith healing. One of the Memphis Mafia, Jerry Schilling, got into a motorcycle accident and was confined to a hospital for 2 weeks in excruciating pain. Elvis visited and waved his hands over Jerry's back for 20 or 30 minutes, and the pain almost completely went away. Elvis's grandmother, Minnie, claimed that he could reduce her arthritis by making passes over her body. His wife Priscilla said he often stopped her headaches with just the laying on of hands. Another member of the Mafia, Sonny West, made light of Elvis's new spiritual direction and was skeptical of his efforts to develop his spiritual powers. Even so, when his baby son had a high fever one day, he let Elvis see what he could do. When Elvis left a half hour later, the boy's temperature had dropped from 103 to below 100. Sonny and his wife said they were amazed. Actress Deborah Walley co-starred with Elvis in the 1966 film Spin Out. She said later that her conversations with him altered her life. She recalled him saying one day, "I'm not a man, I'm not a woman. I'm a soul, a spirit, a force. I have no interest in anything of this world. I want to live in another dimension entirely." I had no idea Elvis was like this until I got studying him. Part of the lesson in the impersonal life was the importance of focusing on spiritual things, on breaking attachments to the material world. Elvis had always been a generous person. There's a story about him at the age of 5. His parents, who were quite poor, gave him a tricycle. They managed to come up with money for a tricycle for Christmas. And he rode it around the yard a few days, and then they noticed it was gone one day. And they asked him what he'd done with it, what had happened. Did he leave it somewhere? And he said he gave it away to a friend. So the father went over and talked to the family and got it back. And a day or two later, it happened again. You know, he gave it away because he thought this other kid didn't have one. And so finally the parents let it go. After all, Do you want to take a child with a big heart and teach him to be possessive? Elvis's generosity is legendary. He gave away jewelry, clothing, cars, motorcycles, boats, trailers, even houses to his staff and his friends. But that was just the beginning. He heard that a record producer he liked was on dialysis and having trouble getting a kidney. He gave $100,000 to speed up the process. Singer Jackie Wilson suffered a heart attack on stage and spent years in a comatose state before he passed away. Elvis gave $40,000 for his care in a nursing home. An old Army buddy developed cerebral palsy. Elvis bought him a specially equipped car, paid a nurse to take care of him, and hired the man's father as a gate guard at Graceland. One of Elvis's men came across an article about an elderly black woman in Memphis who had no legs and went from place to place on boards with roller skates on the bottom. Elvis ordered the best electric wheelchair on the market and personally delivered it to her home without any warning. On top of all that, every Christmas he divided $50,000 to $100,000 among 50 Memphis charities. Elvis worked hard at becoming more spiritual, but he kept hoping for some dramatic change, some feeling that he was achieving what he was supposed to and living up to his potential. That change didn't come, and he got discouraged. On top of that, in the late 60s, his popularity as an actor was beginning to wane. He bought a ranch just across the border from Memphis in Mississippi. He brought all the mafia there and set up his own version of a commune. It didn't really work out the way he wanted, but still he was relaxed and he was living in the country, surrounded by his friends. He kept putting off going back to Hollywood to film Clam Bake. Colonel Parker had been unhappy with Elvis's religious kick ever since Larry Geller came into his life. The colonel didn't like Elvis to be focused on anything but his career. He obviously had a vested interest in keeping him focused on that. He finally put his foot down. He called and demanded that Elvis honor his contract. But after Elvis arrived in LA, shortly before filming started, he had an accident. He woke up one night to use the restroom and tripped and fell and hit his head on the bathtub. It gave him a severe concussion, and he began having dizzy spells. The studio had to delay the start of filming for 2 weeks. Colonel Parker did what he had never done before, which was to intervene in Elvis's private life. He blamed Elvis's personal dissatisfaction and decline in popularity on his religious kick. He accused Geller of putting things in his head, playing mind games with him. He forbade Geller to discuss spirituality with Elvis, and Geller was shocked to see Elvis go along with the colonel's commands. Soon afterward, he quit and moved on. Prodded by the colonel, Elvis married Priscilla and refocused on his personal life. Priscilla had never really shared his interest in the new spiritual direction. It bored her. She urged Elvis to burn all the books he had been reading. 9 months later, Lisa Marie was born, and Elvis settled into a reasonably normal life. But this was the era of Vietnam and Haight-Ashbury and Easy Rider. Elvis's music had lost its edge, and his movies were considered fluff. His career was in the doldrums. Then Colonel Parker got him a deal for a TV special for Christmas 1968. The colonel had in mind that he would stand on stage and sing Christmas carols. But Elvis and the director of the special both saw it as an opportunity to show America how great a performer he really was. The title of the show was simply Elvis, but within days afterward, people referred to it as the comeback special. Elvis resurrected his career. He followed that up with some remarkable new songs, Suspicious Minds and In the Ghetto, and all of a sudden he was back at the top. Then the colonel made a deal for Elvis to perform in Las Vegas at the International Hotel. That really reignited his career. People knew Elvis for his great voice and his charisma, but no one really understood how incredible a performer he was until he came out on stage and showed them. He became a phenomenon all over again. But just like before, he still felt that something was missing. And after every show, he'd call his gospel singers to his suite and sing with them for hours. This is after sometimes 2 shows a day. He started buying new copies of the books that he had burned. The women in his life at that time recalled nights with him when there was no sex, just reading aloud in bed from The Prophet and the Impersonal Life. He renewed his friendship with Diamata. He told her he still wasn't satisfied with his role. Being wildly popular as a performer was not enough. I want to feel God's love, he said. I want to give back. I want to awaken in all these young people a closer relationship with God. After years of drifting apart, Priscilla divorced him in October 1973. His downward trajectory started that same year. He performed in 168 shows around the country. To keep up the pace, he took greater and greater amounts of medication. His pill problem had started in 1958 in the Army, when a sergeant offered him some amphetamines so that he could stay awake for his guard duty. After he returned to the States, he kept taking them to avoid being tired and to stay slim for the movie roles. He had no concerns about the artificial boost they gave him. After all, weren't they made by pharmaceutical companies? Didn't doctors prescribe them? Weren't they completely safe? 1973 is when the crazy stuff began. He developed severe insomnia and depression. He started firing pistols indoors at lamps and TVs and toilets. He started canceling shows on a regular basis, and he made a habit of dashing backstage to use an oxygen bottle. He took staggering amounts of pills in those last few years. Just for the period from 1975 through mid-1977, his family doctor prescribed 5,458 amphetamines, 9,567 sedatives, and 3,988 narcotics over a 2.5-year period. And that was just Memphis. In Los Angeles, there was Dr. Shapiro. In Palm Springs, Dr. Kaplan. And in Las Vegas, Dr. Ghanem. He also received medication from his dentist, Dr. Hoffman. Of course, we all know how it ended. The abuse caught up with him. But he continued to be a seeker right up to the very end. When his body was discovered on August 16, 1977, there was a book lying next to him on the floor. The Scientific Search for the Face of Jesus. It was a book about the Turin Shroud. I mentioned earlier that Elvis didn't reveal everything about his epiphany in northern Arizona when he saw the face of Jesus in a cloud. Late in his career, he finally did. He had renewed his friendship with Larry Geller, and they were sitting outside his Palm Springs home one night when he sheepishly admitted the whole truth. It wasn't just that he had seen the face of Jesus. The message he received was that he himself was Jesus, that he was meant to be the Messiah for our time. Now, the curious thing is, John Lennon had the same experience. He came into a meeting one day with the other Beatles and told them that he was the new Messiah. Of course, they knew he'd been taking huge amounts of LSD. They just took it in stride. But Elvis had no one to share his feeling with. He kept it to himself and carried the burden of that realization for 9 years. If you think about it, in 1967, it must have been a relief to assume that the Colonel was right, that Geller had been planting strange ideas in his head. It gave Elvis an out, an excuse to slip back into a normal life, to marry Priscilla and be a father to Lisa Marie. Given time, given the hindsight of a few more years, he was able to distance himself from Elvis, the entertainer people treated like a deity. He reinterpreted what had happened that day. He saw himself instead as a man, charismatic but still human, who had been singled out for a mission. His mission was to uplift people. He admitted as much when he said, I'm not a preacher. I'm an entertainer, a singer. That's how God and the Brotherhood are helping and using me. That's my role, and I love it. After Elvis died, a lot of his fans just didn't want to accept it. There was a rash of Elvis sightings. I'll leave you with the one I found most interesting. This was the story of a Georgia police officer. It was recorded by a psychiatrist who interviewed him, and the psychiatrist said he came across as a very level-headed man. The psychiatrist gave the policeman the fictitious name of Harold Welch and called his estranged son Tony. Both were Elvis fans. Harold and Tony had a heated argument, and the son took off from Atlanta for Los Angeles. He had $2,000 in savings, and the father worried he'd get involved with drugs. For 2 weeks, the family didn't hear anything from Tony. So Harold and another son decided to fly out to LA to try to find him. Before leaving, Harold had a dream. Elvis came to his office wearing a police jacket and showed Harold a badge, which is funny because Elvis always had this fascination for badges. He told Harold that he was worried about Tony. He wanted to show Harold where to find him. There was a map of Los Angeles on the wall in the dream, and Elvis pointed to a spot. But Elvis had trouble focusing on the street names. Harold had troubles focusing on the street names in the dream. Then Elvis somehow took him there and showed him the location, pointing out a corner drugstore with a small hamburger stand just across the street. Then he led Harold up the street to a rooming house. There were similar buildings beside it, and Elvis made him focus on the front door of one of those. When Harold kept losing focus, Elvis grabbed him by the arm and shook him. "Look, man, you got to look at this. This is important." He told him his son was on drugs. Harold memorized the front of the building and thanked Elvis and woke up with a headache and ringing in his ears. Harold flew to Los Angeles with Tony's brother. They checked with local police to learn the best neighborhoods to scout, then rented a car and started to search. 6 days later, at 2 p.m, Harold recognized the corner drugstore from his dream. He looked across the street, and sure enough, there was the hamburger stand. Midway down the block, Harold found 3 similar-looking rooming houses. He studied the front door of each one carefully until he recognized the door Elvis had shown him. When he knocked on that door, an elderly woman answered. Harold asked her, "Ma'am, do you have a Tony Welch living here?" She replied, "Well, yes, I do." He introduced himself to Tony's father, and she directed him upstairs to the boys' room. Harold knocked, and he heard Tony tell him to come on in. He was lying on his bed. Tony went white to see his father in the doorway. After only a few moments of conversation, he confessed that he was ready to come home. Just as Elvis had said in the dream, Tony had turned out to be on drugs. As of yet, Harold hadn't told either son about his dream. But that evening, while they talked in a hotel room before they went back to Atlanta, Tony confided, "Dad, it's the funniest thing. 2 times since I've been out here, I've had dreams about Elvis Presley. In both dreams, he told me you would be coming to get me. He said he was worried about me. He said he would work it out." Thank you all for coming tonight.
Sir, I've heard on several occasions that Elvis was singing and his fans would put up a sign, a poster, "Elvis is King." And then Elvis would publicly correct them.
Yes.
And say, "Elvis is not king, Jesus Christ is king."
Yes.
Are those anecdotes true?
For my research, yes. There was, what I read was a woman had brought him a crown on a pillow and said, "You're the king." And he says, "No, I'm not." He said, "I'm a singer." He said, "The king is Jesus." So, yes. Yes.
Any other question? Oh, way back there, excuse me.
It makes me think of people who are bipolar. This kind of, I attend a support group for depression and bipolar at Central DuPage, and I go there for their speakers. And one guy talked about when he thought he was Jesus. And anyhow, now I'm really interested in looking up the astrology of all this, and I've written down the dates too. Yeah, I don't really have a question, but I mean, amphetamines. I didn't know that he was on all these kinds of drugs, and that'll pull out parts of you. We repress so much, and I remember when I took LSD, I re-experienced being a baby, but it was in symbolic form. I felt I was a baby crying for my parents, who were royal. We were in a medieval castle, that's what I imagined. And my parents were in another room and they couldn't hear me. And in my own life, I was left alone a lot as a baby. So I think with the LSD, drugs can remove defense mechanisms. And what lies underneath can then be symbolicized, or whatever the word would be.
Any comments, Gary?
Yeah, I think part of it certainly had to do with his drug use. I mean, it was medication use, really. But I think a lot of it was the adoration, the adulation that these guys got. I mean, they were always treated like a deity. I mean, the ones at the very top, and speaking of Lennon, too. Yes?
What was the extent of his education? Oh, I'm sorry.
You didn't mention in your research, did you find, was Elvis ever under the care, or did he ever seek the care of a psychiatrist or somebody other than what he thought, the reading and the Geller and so forth, did he ever question his own sanity, or that maybe he was delusional?
I didn't see anything like that, except he kind of shrunk away from that in the late 60s on his own, thinking, something maybe, I've been misled, But no, I found no reference to a psychiatrist, no.
Did the group around Elvis use drugs, and did they encourage him to use drugs, or who was the leader concerning the drugs?
My understanding is he was the leader. I mean, he was the one who tried the amphetamines first, got his guys to use them because it helped them keep up with his pace. He did try marijuana. He did try LSD, but he had one of his guys try it first, just to make sure. And he observed and was there for safety's sake with the guy. And then later on, it was turnabout. That was Sonny West, who ended up taking care of him when his turn came. But I got the feeling that Elvis was always in charge and led the direction.
My question has to do with his understanding of some of these readings, the books that you mentioned. I'm not familiar with them, but I believe his education was quite limited, and yet he was able to comprehend some of these very deep readings. I find that very interesting.
Yeah, all he had was a high school education, but he had a very curious mind and was a voracious reader. So I guess he acquired this. Plus, one of his mafia members was Jerry Schilling, who was a college guy and eventually graduated. So he talked with him, and I believe Geller was a college guy too. So, obviously just because you haven't gotten any formal education doesn't mean you don't have a bright mind. So I think he did.
Maybe a little bit off the wall, I don't know. His performance style was very loose and different than other performers. The swiveling of hips and everything.
Yeah.
A lot of people, that was really kind of shocking. You know, it was almost pornographic what he was doing. To others, it was like, well, this is wonderful.
Yeah.
This is a real loosening
Yeah.
of the usual, very conservative way of a singer performing here. What was he doing? What was that about? Did that come naturally to him, or was it something he developed?
You know, in my understanding of it, it came from his youth, first of all. In the Pentecostal church, when you got the Spirit, you moved, you know, and you didn't worry about if you looked funny or not. You were moving to the music, and or whatever else. Lost my other thought there. Oh, but the influence of black culture, too. He was a big fan of rhythm and blues music. And it had occasionally got to the clubs for blacks down in the South. And that was their style. You know, they didn't stand on a stage like Pat Boone and sing. You know, they got loose, and he did, too. So he kind of took that naturally and didn't mind showing it in front of an audience that was mixed or exclusively white. And I think that's what, you know, electrified people and caused the change.
You use the term Memphis Mafia.
Yeah.
Do you?
Oh, I'm
mean
sorry. I thought people were aware of that. He
Not mafias in New York,
No,
New
no,
Jersey.
no.
Oh, okay.
There was a story in, I think it was in Las Vegas, but for a while, all these guys dressed alike. They had the same kinds of suits and the same kinds of hats, and they were all his henchmen, you know, his close aides, and there were like 8 or 10 or 12 of them. So they came piling out of limousines at a hotel one time. And somebody was standing there with a newsman. We didn't know he was a newsman at the time. And he says, "Who are these guys, Mafia?" And the newsman said, "No, that's the Memphis Mafia," you know, and so it stuck, and he used it in print, and then it took over. So it was a funny, as an aside, Elvis liked to refer to his guys as the 12. At one point, there were 12, too.
Lots of questions. Good.
I wonder what your own motivation has been in looking into these people that have had kind of mystical aspirations.
My motivation? Curiosity. I've always been intrigued by people who are off the charts somehow. So that started, but the John Lennon book started it, and that was mainly just discovering what an incredible guy this person was. I mean, we just tend to think of him as a Beatle and a songwriter, and yeah, he got into the peace movement, but the more I studied him, the more intrigued I got. And it was only after I started delving into his spirituality that I realized in the second book, or as I was doing the first book, that George Harrison was more spiritual oriented than Lennon. So that led to the second one, and then. But to answer your question, curiosity.
I don't understand a lot about musical rights, but does somebody have the rights to his music at this time?
And they're very jealously guarded.
Yeah, I can imagine. Who has the rights?
Actually, a lot of it now was, who was it? One of the big labels bought his early stuff in 1975 or 6. They don't own all of the Elvis music, but I can't remember who it was right now. Was it RCA? Colonel Parker was always trying to work out deals where they made a big influx of money instead of collecting over 20, 30 years, because you never know if you're going to get it. And so he cut a deal with the record people, recording studio company, to buy the rights all at once. And of course, he got rich. The Colonel was always thinking of the Colonel.